This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
We have a great show for you today, 2 segments. Adam's going to talk to us about bees and what was being called colony collapse disorder. But first, Cristina, what's going on with phenylephrine?
Well, autumn is upon us, and checkers, I am here for it. Perhaps it's a Canadian in me, but as much as I enjoy the summer months, I really love the fall season. When leaves begin their vibrant transformation, a crisp chill fills the air, and NBA basketball makes its comeback. It's time to pull out our trusty toques, flannel shirts, and cozy jackets in anticipation of the impending winter. Unfortunately, though, along with this picturesque season, there's something darker lurking. It's also the time when the notorious flu and cold season starts to rear its ugly head, threatening to disrupt our autumnal bliss.
Autumnal bliss.
I don't get sick very often, but when I do, it's typically a miserable sinus cold. Pat can attest to this. The kind that has me reaching for any nasal decongestant meds that hold the promise of any relief from my symptoms. Then last month, a U.S. FDA advisory panel made an official announcement that shooketh many, especially the makers of cold meds, I'm sure, who make money hand over fist selling them. Oral phenylephrine, aka PE, the main ingredient in popular over-the-counter cold and allergy meds like NyQuil, Benadryl, Sudafed, etc., doesn't actually work. As a result, the FDA could potentially initiate the process of removing PE from the market completely, forcing manufacturers to pull meds from store shelves. Now, this is a big deal. According to FDA data, there are 250 products that contain phenylephrine, generating around $1.8 billion in sales last year alone.
We're only talking about the oral form, though, right?
That is correct,
Okay.
and I'll get into that a little bit more.
Okay.
Now, here's an excerpt from a couple of CBC News articles. Advisors to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, voted unanimously against the effectiveness of the key drug found in popular versions of Sudafed, Dayquil, and other medications stocked on store shelves. Modern studies, when well conducted, are not showing any improvement in congestion with phenylephrine, said Dr. Mark Digowitz, an allergy specialist at the St. Louis University School of Medicine. Now, this shouldn't come as a complete surprise because the drug's effectiveness has been challenged before. As CBC News reports, the 2-day meeting by the advisory panel to the U.S. FDA in September was, quote, prompted by University of Florida researchers who petitioned the FDA to remove most PE products based on recent studies showing they failed to outperform placebo pills in patients with cold and allergy congestion. The same researchers also challenged the drug's effectiveness in 2007, but the FDA allowed the products to remain on the market pending additional research. This time, the 16 members of the FDA panel unanimously agreed that current evidence doesn't show a benefit for the drug. Dr. Peter Stark, the agency's lead medical reviewer, told CBC, the bottom line is that none of the original studies stand up to modern standards of study design or conduct. And indeed, an FDA scientific review found many flaws in the 1960s and 70s studies that supported PE's approval. Now, Assistant Professor of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto, Meena Tadra, says, this is a very classic tale where you have drugs that have been approved since the 60s and 70s, and we're kind of just revisiting them now with the lens of data and analysis that we didn't use back then. You were mentioning to me before, Pat, that you wonder what other drugs need revisiting at this point.
Exactly. And not only that, but what prompts them to be revisited.
Right. Yeah. Does it take, in this instance, someone basically calling them out again?
Right. Probably a good question for Ken Milne, actually.
Oh, yeah. We should send him a little note about it. Now, there have also been 3 rigorously conducted studies published since 2016 that show no difference between PE medications and placebos for relieving congestion. Interestingly, these studies were conducted by Merck and Johnson & Johnson and involved hundreds of patients. In Canada, the Canadian Pediatric Society issued a statement around 12 years ago in the journal Pediatrics and Child Health about the ineffectiveness of cold and cough medications. The American Academy of Family Physicians also mentioned that this finding is not especially surprising because oral phenylephrine's effectiveness has been in question for decades. Now, just to be clear, as Pat flagged before, we are talking about the pill form of PE. The drug does seem to demonstrate improved efficacy when administered directly to the nose through sprays or drops, and these specific products are not currently under scrutiny in the US. So this review doesn't affect nasal sprays with the ingredient.
Right.
Okay, so this begs the question. If PE was no better than a placebo in trials, how did it become so widely used in cold meds? It's actually an interesting backstory here, and it traces back to 2005, when the FDA established the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act. More on that in a sec. Although PE is found in many decongestants in Canada, like NyQuil, the drug pseudoephedrine is also readily available in products like Sudafed and allergy medications like Claritin.
Well, not so readily available in the States.
No. I have seasonal allergies, and if they get bad, I can walk into a drugstore, march up the cold and allergy aisle, and pick up a pack of Claritin with pseudoephedrine in it. But the U.S. Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act prohibited the over-the-counter sale of cold medicines containing the widely used pseudoephedrine, mandating that they be sold behind the counter. Now, some of you may wonder why a drug that's shown to be effective would be banned. Well, as the title of the act suggests, it has to do with the highly addictive and illegal drug, at least here in North America, which can be made using pseudoephedrine. When I was in New York many years ago looking for some allergy meds with pseudoephedrine in it, I didn't understand why pharmacies would keep this stuff locked up behind the counter until I learned about the meth connection. So, cold medications containing pseudoephedrine became restricted in the US, and PE, known to be safe, took its place in over-the-counter medication. The Canadian Pediatric Society called phenylephrine's use into question in 2011. Dr. Michael Reeder co-authored a statement outlining the group's position at the time. He's a professor specializing in pediatric clinical pharmacology at Western University in London, Ontario. He told CBC, "Our statement basically said, common cold medications don't work, don't use them." It's pretty straight up. There's no evidence that they work at all. So if you regularly reach for cold meds with PE in them, is the relief you may feel all in your head? Not really, because as Reader notes, decongestants, which also contain ingredients like acetaminophen, can help alleviate cold discomfort.
That makes sense, yeah.
So what happens now? Well, the panel's input paves the way for the FDA to remove PE from the federal list of decongestants considered effective for over-the-counter pills and liquids. The FDA says removing the products would eliminate, quote, unnecessary costs and delay in care of taking a drug that has no benefit. As Axios reports, though, the FDA could be months away from taking any action against PE, and if they do decide to ban the ingredient, they would most likely face lawsuits from drug companies. But I wanted to check if there were any updates before recording this segment, and although we may not hear from the FDA for a while, there is indeed a significant development. CVS Health, which operates one of the largest pharmacy chains in the U.S., recently announced CVS is voluntarily removing common decongestants that contain PE as the only active ingredient from all of their pharmacies. The company confirmed in a statement that it will continue to offer oral cough and cold products. The statement also said, "We are aware of the FDA Advisory Committee's position on oral phenylephrine and will follow direction from the FDA to ensure products we sell comply with all laws and regulations." As for We the North, Health Canada announced it will review the U.S. panel's conclusion that the common decongestant doesn't work, and it will take any necessary action to ensure Canadians have access to safe and effective products. Just as a point of clarification, experts were never debating PE's safety. It's the efficacy that is the issue. At the time of this recording, no other drug companies in the U.S. have stepped up like CVS to make any announcements about removing products from their shelves yet. As CBC News reports, if the FDA follows through on the panel's recommendation, Johnson & Johnson, Bayer, and other drug makers could be required to pull their oral medications containing phenylephrine from store shelves. That would likely force consumers to switch to behind-the-counter pseudoephedrine products or to PE-based nasal sprays and drops. So you may ask, well, why don't we all just take pseudoephedrine? But people with high blood pressure or heart problems or people who suffer from anxiety should not be taking that medication. As for parents with sick kiddos on their hands, Dr. Reeder suggests passing on OTC cough and cold meds for children altogether. He recommends rest, staying hydrated, taking acetaminophen like Tylenol, and for those over 1 year old, a teaspoon of honey a few times a day. He also says to ask your pharmacist for recommendations based on your symptoms. Says Reeder, we're in an age where people are less likely to suck it up. So true. So many of these things just have to run their course. End quote. Not exactly what you want to hear when you're sick, but at least you won't be wasting your money on ineffective treatments. So that's it. One more thing. There's a great Vox video, as in VOX, that I linked to in the show notes called Why Useless Decongestants Are Still for Sale. It's only 10 minutes long, but it really does a compelling job of summarizing the history of decongestants and how we got here.
That's really interesting. Again, I come back to what we were talking about earlier is just like, it looks like a lot of people were doing this research because you mentioned a couple of times that it's come into question. Like, I just wonder how that process works, or if it just kind of happened with this, but doesn't happen with other things. And there's so much money at stake, right? So,
oh my gosh. I'm just telling up in my brain how much money I have spent on those kinds of medications over the last few years since FDA said, no, it's okay. Let's keep them on the market.
Right. Well, they're not cheap. Yeah.
No, they're not. No.
Well, thanks, Cristina. And with that, we'll turn things over to Adam. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
What's up, cuboids? So what's going on with the bees? I recently saw an article whose headline read, "The Beekeepers Who Don't Want You to Buy More Bees." And I thought, hey, what happened with all those dead bees we used to hear about? It seems that problem didn't develop in the way that we thought it would. The bee problem was big news going back to when the phenomenon was first known as colony collapse disorder. This started getting attention back in 2006. I think the first time I heard about it was in an episode of the new Doctor Who, but people talked about it a lot for a while. You would just kind of randomly hear that bees were somehow disappearing. No one knew why. It was some horrible mystery, but people were probably to blame somehow. And this was usually presented in an alarming fashion because bees are sort of integral to pollination. And if bees are dying, what else is dying? Or if bees die, plants can die and, bad stuff. Now, I never really looked into it personally. Darren covered the topic on the show back in 2016, and he talked about whether or not bees were endangered. And the crux of that segment was that certain types of bees were endangered in Hawaii, but the types of bees which support our food supply were not in danger of collapsing, that being that the number of bee colonies had not really changed much at the time. So numbers are higher than they've been in 20 years. Some bees are dying, but beekeepers are replacing them. So at the time, research showed that neonicotinoids was a suspected cause of the impact on the bee population. So neonicotinoids are a type of insecticide. So basically, they're used to kill insects. They spread it on crops to protect the crops, not to protect the insects. They're good at killing what you're trying to kill, but they're also sometimes good at killing other insects that you aren't necessarily trying to kill, for example, bees. So in addition to this, killing insects, there are sublethal effects. So basically, these are other things that could affect bees in more subtle ways than just killing them. So the dose they're exposed to sometimes isn't enough to kill them, but causes effects like messing up their ability to navigate, their ability to forage, negatively affecting their immune response, lowering fertility, and shortening their lifespan. So that's generally bad if you're a bee. Now, even though neonicotinoids are bad for insects, they aren't very toxic to birds and animals. It's kind of how they're designed. They're insecticides. So what's going on these days? A 2020 article from the Genetic Literacy Project kind of puts a lot of this into question. A bit like Darren mentioned in the 2016 article, the honeybee population itself is not at risk. The 2016 numbers were high. The 2016 numbers were higher than they'd been in decades. And the article explains that honeybees are a managed species, a bit like livestock. So you think about the total cow population on Earth. So that's not really related to sort of births and deaths of wild cows and the natural risks to cows' health. It's related to farming practices and how many cows they breed. The amount of cows in the world is pretty closely related to the amount of cows that farmers want to have in the world. Honeybees are bred by beekeepers and shipped around the country to pollinate crops. They're not a native species in North America, and they were brought here by colonists from Europe. It's not to say that they're useless here, as they're used to pollinate crops, many of which actually came from Europe as well. So the populations can vary due to many factors, and this includes beekeeping practices. Veromites are a huge risk to bees. So they're a parasite which attaches to the bee's body, it weakens it, and it also transmits viruses to the bees, much like mosquitoes transmit malaria to humans and other animals. Pesticides, such as the often blamed neonicotinoids, do play a part in bee deaths, but many entomologists, such as May Berenbaum at the University of Illinois, think it's a small contributor and that banning these substances will have little effect on bee populations. Other effects that people suspect of being reasons are things like cell phone towers, 5G, and stuff like that, and there's not a lot of good evidence for that. Climate change is often blamed, and while it alone doesn't account for the problem, it's likely a factor as climate change can affect the bees' habitats. Habitat loss caused by many factors, including climate change, can negatively affect bee populations. All this said, bee losses over winters are sometimes double what they used to be, but populations are able to remain constant or rise due to the beekeeping practices. So the end of the world doesn't seem like it will be caused by a lack of bees. Now, it's not ideal, but you can split a hive to grow the numbers. Basically, you take some eggs, larvae, bees, and food from a healthy colony, and you create a new separate colony with a pregnant queen. The new colony grows. There are a bunch more bees. Great. So pollination fees have gone up just because, there's more problems with bees, has to be done more often. Honey prices have also gone up, and this is generally profitable to beekeepers. They don't hate that. Pollination fees are a very small percentage of the cost of farming crops. Things like almonds depend on bees to pollinate them. So even a substantial increase in pollination fees doesn't necessarily result in that much cost to the farmers. So that doesn't really cause an increase to food at the grocery store. But there's a lot of other reasons for which the cost of food has gone up considerably in the last few years. The colony collapse disorder, or CCD, whatever those specific causes may be, isn't as big a problem as it used to be. More recently, beekeepers only attribute about 20% of their losses to colony collapse disorder. So, it used to be a big problem. We thought it would not stop, but it seems to just not be a big deal anymore. Pesticide use has changed, and this doesn't seem to be a huge factor in what's killing the bees. Beyond low honeybee populations not being a huge concern, there could actually be other concerns, that being too many bees. So a recent article in the Seattle Times, like I mentioned, the beekeepers who don't want you to buy more bees. So the pervasive idea that bees are disappearing is so strong that many corporations are starting new bee colonies to try to help them. But this isn't really necessary. In fact, by having more honeybees, they tend to outcompete other bee species, threatening biodiversity of other pollinators. So, for example, the article mentions the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, which boasts about having 4 beehives on their roof. So what's this doing to help anybody? The problem here isn't a lack of bees because the Museum of Modern Art isn't a farm with crops. They don't really need them to do anything. Flowers need bees to help pollinate. So do these bees really help pollinate much? There's flowers in Central Park. It's not really far from the Museum of Modern Art, so the bees could help pollinate there. I don't really know if New York City has a bee deficiency problem or if the flowers in New York City aren't pollinating enough. But that's kind of the idea here. What do we need bees for? So further, we've got people producing honey, but who can't sustain what the bees need to eat because there aren't enough flowers around. So honeybees need nectar from flowers. So if the bee population outweighs the flower population, you have to feed bees sugar because they aren't getting enough nectar. A lack of food and a lack of flowers is a contributor to decreasing bee populations. So the bee populations will vary with the amount of food that they have naturally in that environment. So instead of making more bees, make more flowers. So promote the native bee population, not honeybees, by having more flowers, ideally sort of the flowers that are in the area growing there. So this brings me to a sort of beef of mine, which I wanted to do as its own segment, but I couldn't find a lot of good evidence one way or the other. But I'll talk about it here. So it's this concept called no mow May. So I have a yard and a lawn, as many people do in Canada. They do in North America. I think they don't around the world, but in some countries, that's a thing that people have. So in all my local sort of community Facebook groups, there are all these posts around April, May, encouraging no mow May. Basically, don't mow your lawn in May so that it helps flowers grow, which helps the bees pollinate, and in turn, save the bees and all that stuff. So in theory, there's some sense here because you'd be helping native bee populations, the pollinators that sort of go around naturally, by doing this, right? A little refresher on the birds and the bees. You've got nectar and flowers, and birds and bees go from plant to plant eating the nectar, and this sort of takes a little bit from them and leaves them in another plant, and this cross-pollinates, which is basically like plants having sex. So plants can reproduce sexually or asexually, and this is their method of sexually reproducing. They can exchange genetic material. It creates offspring that are genetically diverse. So part of me wonders, does no mow May really make a big difference? So there's a lot of grass out there. My yard isn't a huge part of it, at least where I live. I live in a small subdivision in the municipality of Chelsea, Quebec. It's basically a strip of land between the vast, expansive Gatineau Hills and the Gatineau River. My property is a decent size, but it's much less than an acre. It's not a huge country lot. It's a backyard and a front yard, which I can mow it all in less than an hour. So behind my house, there's a creek, which isn't mowed. It has all sorts of wild plants there. Leads to a little forest, which also doesn't get mowed. Has tons of plants there. So what exactly is not mowing my tiny little lawn doing in the grand scheme of things? It seems like a drop in the bucket to me. When I look at some numbers, I did find that the U.S. total amount of lawn covering the country is 128,000 square kilometers. The total country being 100 million square kilometers. So about 1%. So don't mow your lawn for a month to get more flowers on 1%. And, a lot of that 1% isn't going to be people's lawns, but it's going to be like golf courses and, lawns for fields and things like that. Also, this idea might not work everywhere. So there's a push for this by, some hippies in Canada and stuff like that. But it all started in the UK and was adopted here uncritically. So in Canada, in May, the grass grows quickly. If you don't mow in May, the grass itself suffers. So you let it grow too much and then you mow it in June. This allows a lot of weeds to spread across your lawn. And well, that kind of sucks if you want to have a nice lawn. So you'll mostly just end up with dandelions in Canada, which are a weed. Yes, they're a flower, but they're not a good source of food for bees. If your lawn is overrun with weeds, you might end up using pesticides to control that, which could in turn be bad for bees. Sweet irony. And also, the point of it is to have more bees, but I don't want bees in my yard. So I don't want to get stung by bees and wasps and stuff like that. I don't want weeds in my yard, and I don't want bees there. The bees can hang out in the vast fields and green areas where I'm not playing with my kids and having lunch. I like raccoons, but that doesn't mean I should keep my compost bin unlocked to encourage them to rummage around in my trash and basically just make a mess. But if you somehow do think it would be cool to support bees and encourage them to buzz around your property, you should have flowers, not a crappy, poorly maintained lawn. If you're concerned about the native pollinators, then try to find out what kind of native flowers you can plant. This will, of course, vary depending on where you live. If my experience is any indication, you can probably find a lot of hippies in your local Facebook groups all talking about what the native plants are and stuff like that. I'm sure people would be happy to contribute to that conversation. Bees. It's all a bit more complicated than you might have heard. Colony collapse disorder is a thing, but the reasons for it are varied, not simply due to insecticides. Honeybees, which aren't native to North America, are a managed species which exists where they're needed for honey and pollination, and their numbers have remained fairly steady over decades. Forcing more of them simply for the sake of having more bees can unintentionally harm the native pollinators in your area. And mow your lawn, or you'll just get a bunch of weeds. Peace out, QBs.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.